I have a series of questions that Quakers from Yorkshire and beyond have sent in to ask, mostly to want to kind of get to know a bit more about what's going on in Bradford Peace Studies, the area of conflict resolution, and about yourself.
Right.
So I guess wanting just to start off, just if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the Peace Studies Department.
My interest in the whole area of peace and conflict really began probably when I first sort of ventured outside of the boundaries of the UK when I was about 20. I pretty much stayed in Essex for my formative years, but then I took a job immediately after university in teaching English in a school in Sri Lanka. And this was in, I think, 1989, and there was a huge civil war going on there, which I probably wasn't aware of when I took the job. And I went over there and was absolutely appalled and completely overwhelmed with what I saw there. Some of the things that I saw going on in Sri Lanka, and the experiences of being in a place where there were sort of curfews at night and military checkpoints everywhere, and where sounds of gunfire and things like this that I'd never experienced at all before. And seeing, travelling around Sri Lanka and seeing whole towns that were just heaps of rubble. Obviously, I mean, that was an experience that really, really stayed with me. And I think that's what sort of eventually led me into this area. I mean, for me, I think conflict resolution is something that's not necessarily... it's not necessarily the sort of big picture stuff. I think there's all kinds of levels at which you can look at conflict resolution. And there's all kinds of contexts in which it can happen. And I think one of the things that we're thinking is that we're going to try to broaden, particularly sort of in terms of the curriculum, but also in our research, we're looking at trying to broaden away from the idea that you get the key leaders together in a room and you sort out their differences, and that's the way of doing things. I mean, I think today, or the sort of the critical edge, if you like, of conflict resolution research is about looking about how things work from below. And so it's not all about the ceasefire, even though a ceasefire obviously is an important thing to try to achieve. It's not about the peace agreement necessarily, because so often those things are just imposed from the top anyway. It's about looking at the relationships that people build in all different types of ways on the ground. And I think if you start to look at it like that, actually we're in a period at the moment where things are changing very rapidly. I mean, partly because of things like social media, and that's a really expanding area for research on conflict resolution, because it's not so much negotiations, but how do people build relationships with each other? How do they understand each other's positions? How do they get information about each other? And the sort of networks that are possible through social media really make those processes of sort of identity formation and ideas about othering and things like that. They all work in different ways once you bring social media into it. For 20 years or more, the shift has been away from interstate conflict to internal conflict, civil wars and things. But what I think is perhaps has been neglected over the last 20 years is looking at the impact of inequality on conflict, internal conflict, because we're in a situation now, certainly in the part of the world where I'm interested in, which is mainly East Asia. That's the area where I've done all my research, but also this is true in Africa and Latin America as well. And actually, you could say this is also true in Britain as well. That most poor people now live in relatively rich countries compared to, in the 1970s, you had, the rich West and everybody else was poor. Now, if you go to somewhere like Shanghai or even cities like Jakarta or Manila, you find, huge wealth and absolute poverty, absolutely side by side. And so that, I think, is going to be increasingly a challenge, and I don't think we've really yet seen the implications of how that's what kind of new conflicts that's going to produce.
Kind of leading on from that, one of the questions was that Quakers are very keen on conflict resolution. I think it's something Quakers often pride themselves in terms of supporting conflict resolution, peace. And the question was around, can that enthusiasm have a downside? And I guess you're starting to say, what happens when resolution can't be reached. I mean, which you were actually talking a bit about. Maybe resolution is not always the
I think
final
it
goal.
depends. Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, we usually sort of distinguish between conflict resolution and conflict transformation. So, that conflict resolution means solving everybody's problems, if you like, everybody coming to an agreement, and I think that's that's difficult to achieve in any situation. But conflict transformation is something slightly different, because it means getting to the point where maybe the conflict still remains. I still don't agree with you on the best way to do one thing or another, but that we can somehow move past it. And I think that's what we're looking for conflicts to be to be productive rather than destructive, because I think conflict is productive. Debates are productive. Even tension to some extent can be productive. But what's obviously not what we don't want to see is that turning into hatred, or a lack of empathy for one another, or a lack of violence in the worst case. So I think there's a lot of space between conflict resolution and violence, in which things can be quite productive. But for me, I think the point that we have to cultivate is that sort of empathy, so that although we can disagree on things, and we can have perhaps quite deep disagreements, quite principled disagreements on things, but nevertheless we can empathise, or the parties to the conflict can empathise with one another as human beings. And that's where I think that the most productive sort of techniques come from, so that you can bring people together in situations where they can recognise one another as fellow human beings, deserving of certain types of respect, and then that then gives you a basis for then trying to find areas of agreement as well as areas of disagreement, and hoping that relationship building process will lead to something positive.
Well, could you talk about, from your experience, maybe in East Asia or somewhere else, some example of effective conflict resolution or transformation processes?
I don't know if I would call this effective conflict resolution. I still don't quite know what to think about this story, but and it raised a lot of kind of ethical dilemmas for me. But I think if you can give people different reasons for doing things, or different goals, then you can transform their attitudes to conflict quite significantly. And that's something that sometimes international aid can do that. Sometimes a really good aid project in particular types of circumstances can change people's goals and make it worthwhile to become more peaceful. And that in itself, it's hard to know whether that's really conflict transformation. If you took away the aid, would they start fighting again? But an example of this is that this was also in Cambodia, a local level development project that was implemented by the UN, and it took the form of grants to local government, but they specified that the local government had to have a meeting of villagers, and the villagers had to decide on a list of priorities. So a participatory development process, basically. They had to decide on a list of priorities, and then the top priorities would be funded through this grant. And that was a big change in Cambodia, because they'd never had anything really participatory before. And I went there to do some research on this programme, and the donors who were running the program, it was a UN programme, the donors who were running the programme in Phnom Penh said, oh, you must go up to this particular province and see the provincial governor there, because he's a real star of the programme. He's been doing loads of stuff, getting loads of things done, and it's really worked up there. So I went to this province, and the province was in the northwest on the Thai border. It was a province where there'd been a huge amount of fighting. And I went to the town hall and saw the provincial governor. And when I met him, I suddenly realised that the guy I was speaking to had actually, the UN Transitional Authority in Cambodia, the peacekeeping mission in Cambodia, had tried to arrest this guy for war crimes, and he'd been really kind of infamous as a really kind of horrible sort of human rights abusing warlord in the northwest. And the UN had never managed to arrest him. He'd always, and they'd, some his sort of political allies in Phnom Penh had sort of said, we won't cooperate with the peace process anymore if you go after this. And it was and the UN backed down, and that was a big embarrassment for the UN at the time. So there was a big, this was a very controversial and really nasty guy. And yet, he's when I was talking to him about this development project, he was saying, this development program has changed my life. Now I go into a village and everyone calls me uncle. And it's, and it's great because, I can give the villagers stuff. I don't just have to frighten them anymore, so they do what I say. And he was, and the people in Phnom Penh were convinced that this guy, and I don't know what to think about that, because I don't think that people should get away with really horrible crimes, and the idea that this guy has somehow changed, it's hard to know in that sort of situation, but I often think about that, and I often think, did that guy really change? Was he just pretending to get the money? Is that what we should be doing though with aid? If we can't arrest them, should we be converting them to something different? And that's a real, it's a real dilemma, and I don't know, I quite often talk to students about that, and they it often gets really good discussion with the students, because some of them say no, absolutely, he should be arrested and brought to the International Criminal Court, which yes, he should be, but on the other hand, if you can't do that, are people, should we let people reform? I don't know. It's a really tricky one, that one. But it does show that things change, and that things can change quite remarkably. I mean, just in the space of a few years, that somebody's whole whole attitude and whole sort of identity goes from being this horrific, scary warlord to being uncle.
But what do you see as potential causes of future conflict, and how can we be responding? I know you've talked a lot about inequality.
Yeah. Well, I think, yes, inequality is a big one. And I think, climate change is another one. I mean, that's something that I'm increasingly sort of terrified by, really. The increasing inequality is, to some extent, related to this promotion of self-interest and sort of decline of a sense of responsibility to other people. And I think that seeing that, I think if our response to climate change turns out to be similar to our response to, for example, the global financial crisis, then I think we're probably in a lot of trouble, because I think climate change is going to cause, well, I mean, obviously we don't know exactly what form it's going to take, and I don't have any, specialist scientific knowledge on this, but I mean, as far as I understand it, it's going to require quite significant modifications in the way that we live, either because we want to avert it or because it's happening and we need to adjust to it. And I think that's going to require people to be quite generous. And if we can't be generous, if we've lost the capacity to be generous, and if we've lost the capacity to, sympathise with other people, and to feel that it's incumbent upon us to try to help people who are sort of less fortunate than ourselves in some ways. I mean, maybe we'll turn out to be the less fortunate ones, but I mean, if generally that's true, then I think there's huge potential for conflict, because patterns of resource distribution are going to be changed. There's the amount of land that we have available is going to change, the amount of water we have available, the amount of food that we have available. All of these things are going to change quite dramatically. And even if there's still sort of technically speaking enough to go round, we don't know, where is it going to be, who's going to have it, and are they going to be, would we be willing to share? If we turn out to be the lucky ones, will we be willing to share? And,
based on the way the world currently
exactly.
is, it doesn't look like it.
Yeah, no, it's, and so I think that it's going to make these problems, these problems are already acute, and I think they're going to be even more acute. I think we need to, I think for individuals, I think it means that we need to really try to think about how we can try to sort of reclaim that way of living in our relationships with other people, and then try to and through organisations that we belong to, see if we can do that too. And that's just as important, really, as the sort of carbon emissions agenda and all the rest of it. It's the sort of mindset behind reductions of emissions that's going to be just as important, because the fact is we don't really know what's going to be required. Yeah. So it's I think it's just an immense challenge, and it's a really quite frightening one, and I don't think we're in a very good position to deal with it. I think we've probably been in a better position sort of 30, 40 years ago than we are now, because I think things have gone the other way over the past 30, 40 years in terms of, you know, selfishness and you know, the decline of a willingness to accept obligations. I don't know, decline of community is what I'm talking about, really. Yeah.